Hello everyone, and welcome to our annual lecture in Animal Rights Law and Policy. Welcome to everyone joining us today online as well. My name, for those of you who may not know me, who haven't had the chance to meet, is Manisha Deka, and I'm professor here at the Faculty of Law and Limestone Chair as well, and I also direct the Animals in Society Research Initiative. Here at the University of Victoria, we of course would like to start off with a land acknowledgement and acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and the Sanish peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. As we see spring unfolding about us on campus, we can be especially grateful. And as you think about the title and the annual lecture series, I think we can also be grateful for a different type of history in terms of valuation of animals, a chance to recall the multi-species effects of colonialism, and as we may know and see a building around us, that is our new Center for National Center on Indigenous Laws that is being built, and we can be hopeful about a different way of seeing animals given the increasing recognition within Canada and other settler colonial states about the multi-jural nature of law and legal orders. So today we warmly welcome Professor Pamela Frasch from Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland, Oregon, where she'll be presenting under the title, The Uncomfortable Future of Animal Law, Even If Everything Goes Right. Pamela Frasch is the Brooks McCormick Jr. Scholar of Animal Law and Policy at Lewis and Clark Law School and founder of the Center for Animal Law Studies, CALS. So CLS is an academic animal law program with a focus on research, teaching, and experiential education. The mission of CALS is to educate the next generation of animal law attorneys, lawyers, and advance animal protection through the law. Previously, Professor Frasch served as General Counsel for the Animal Legal Defense Fund, a premier national not-profit animal protection law organization that seeks to protect the lives and advance the interests of animals through the legal system. She was the first person ever to be appointed Dean of Animal Law, a position she held in addition to teaching from 2010 to 2020. In addition to her duties with CALS, Professor Frasch is the author of multiple publications, including various textbooks that are leaders in the field. She's co-author of the premier American legal casebook, Animal Law Cases and Materials, now in its 6th edition. The casebook has been used by over 160 law schools in the United States and is credited with helping to bring the field about and to shape it forward. She's also co-author of Animal Law in a Nutshell, now in its 3rd edition. We will have time following the presentation for questions and answers. If you'd like to post a question online, please do so in the Q&A section. We'll be happy to read it out. With no further ado, I will turn it over to Professor Frasch.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so happy that all of you are here today as well. And one of the things that I think about the work that we do, and I'm assuming that everybody here is interested in animals and in animal protection, animal rights. And I think for most of us, we have what I would call an origin story. That thing that maybe happened when you were a kid that really made a difference and made you feel committed to doing something for animals. So I don't normally share this story with people, but I wanted to share it today because this incident, I think, really animated my very early interest in animal protection. So I was a little kid, 5 years old, and there was a family down the street. They had a little dog that they kept in the yard on a tether, like a 6-foot tether. One day I was walking down the block, and the dog was on the tether, and they had a 10-year-old boy, and he was there with a garden hose, and he was whipping this little dog in ways that was causing the dog to yip in pain and to be running and to be trying to get away, but of course couldn't because she was on this tether. And I was there. I was like 5 years old, he was 10 years old, and I remember just feeling this rage that how could somebody be so cruel? How could somebody be so inhumane? How it's so unfair. And my rage was also fueled by the fact that I felt so helpless. I was this little kid, 5 years old, and here was this boy who was twice as old, twice as big, probably 10 times as strong. What could I do to stop what was happening there? And I remember so clearly in my little kid brain just thinking, someday I really want to do something that will just make life a little bit better for the little dogs like this one that I'm seeing right here. And I have to say that story, obviously it stuck with me. That was a long time ago. And it's really that commitment to fairness and compassion and empathy and justice is something that still really motivates me today. And perhaps that's something that motivates some of you today. We're learning so much more now about animal sentience, cognition, agency. So we have even a greater understanding than we once did. There we go. These are just some of the books. Just a smattering, thank you so much, a smattering of the books that have addressed animal sentience. We know so much more now today than we did then, so we understand that the suffering that they endure is even more horrible than what we had imagined. And so knowing that, our mission becomes ever more important. And so on some level, I think most of us are really interested in trying to see the establishment of some type of animal rights or animal personhood. And that really gets us to the heart of our conversation today. So the question I'm going to ask you is, are we genuinely prepared for a world in which non-human animals possess enforceable legal rights? Are we really? So let me clarify what I'm asking. I'm not talking about slightly less horrific factory farming conditions, or what I like to call the marginally less miserable approach to animal welfare. I'm inviting us to confront something far more profound, a legal paradigm in which animals are recognized as rights bearers in their own capacity, rights that exist not because we humans are feeling particularly generous that day, but because they possess inherent moral and legal standing that demands recognition, where animals are not just protected from harm, but are allowed to thrive. And speaking of thriving, I know that oftentimes in these types of presentations, you are subjected to a lot of videos and photos that show the challenging conditions under which animals are kept. And those can be really awful, and it's important to bear witness, it's important to know what's going on. However, I also think it's important to keep in mind, what are we striving for? What are we aspiring to? So I'm very happy to tell you that the next 30 slides or so are just of animals thriving. So it's something for us to remember. This is what we are trying to accomplish. So we've all fantasized about that magical day when animals finally possess enforceable rights, and everybody celebrates as if we've solved the problem. But here's what those feel-good dreams don't really show you: the messy, complex, utterly disruptive aftermath. It's like watching the first 10 minutes of a disaster movie and going, oh, there's an asteroid. Great, we've solved the problem. No. That's just when the real story begins. So consider, if you will, a hypothetical but increasingly plausible scenario. Tomorrow, the Supreme Court of Canada or the Supreme Court of the United States issues a landmark ruling declaring that animals can no longer be classified as property, but must be recognized as legal persons with fundamental rights. The champagne cork pops in animal rights organizations around the world, and then what? What exactly? What are we going to do? Would industrial farms face the legal equivalent of a meteor strike and have to just completely shut down immediately because now everything they do is a systemic rights violation? Would laboratories have to explain to their researchers that, you know what, the experiment you want to do, you can't do unless you get informed consent from the rats? Would pet stores need to rebrand as adoption centers overnight with sales prices becoming recommended guardian donations? Would we have a moral obligation to intervene when a lion takes down a gazelle in what could now legally classify as murder? So you might be thinking, yeah, these questions are interesting philosophical thought experiments, academic exercises, rather than practical legal concerns. But I assure you, these questions have transcended the realm of hypothetical speculation. Courts from Argentina to New Zealand are already grappling with these very issues, and the theoretical has become practical. The future is knocking on the door, and it's knocking rather insistently. So the progress toward animal rights, while ethically imperative, will necessitate confronting deeply uncomfortable realities. If we're genuinely committed to the principle of non-human rights, we must also be prepared to address its far-reaching implications for our legal systems, economic structures, cultural practices, and collective identities. So today, I invite you to envision that future, one in which the moral and legal status of animals is finally recognized, and a future where, to paraphrase Martin Luther King Jr., the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice for all sentient beings. But of course, that bend is going to create a whole lot of serious turbulence. So some aspects of this transformation will be profoundly affirming, right? Others will be deeply unsettling. And certain consequences, frankly speaking, will be so disruptive that they're going to make current political divisions that we're seeing today just look like friendly agreements over what movie to watch. However, if we are unprepared to confront the consequences of success in this movement, then we cannot claim to be genuinely committed to success at all. The hard part isn't necessarily tearing down the old system, it's building up a new system. And in the United States right now, we are seeing that unfold in real time. So, let's begin by acknowledging a fundamental legal reality that has shaped animal-human relationships for centuries. Our legal system has persistently categorized non-human animals as things rather than persons, as property subject to ownership rather than beings with inherent rights. Now, this classification isn't some obscure legal technicality, it's the foundation upon which we've built entire industries and cultural practices and ethical frameworks. It's the legal bedrock that permits us to buy, sell, confine, experiment upon, and kill billions of sentient beings annually without legal consequences. Now, I'm not suggesting that our legal ancestors sat around sort of rubbing their hands in glee and thinking, oh, we're just going to make all the animals property. More likely, they were simply codifying what seemed obvious to them at the time, much as it once seemed obvious that women couldn't vote and that certain humans could be owned as property. History does have a way of making even our most confidently held positions look profoundly disturbing and embarrassing in retrospect. Rutgers law professor Gary Francione, whom many of you may have heard about or read, he describes our current approach to animals as moral schizophrenia. And I kind of like that. I think it's true. On the one hand, we have anti-cruelty laws that acknowledge animals can suffer. On the other hand, we legally classify these same beings as things. It's kind of like saying, we recognize that this being right here can feel fear and distress and pain, but now, excuse me, while I just treat it like a table or a toaster. It makes no sense. University of Toronto professor Angela Fernandez, who many of you know, traces this property-based concept back to early common law practices. She demonstrates how even the most cognitively sophisticated non-human animals were legally classified as chattel, a designation that fundamentally precludes meaningful legal protections. As Professor Fernandez observes, throughout legal history, the law has made half steps toward recognizing the interests of animals, but has largely failed to address the fundamental contradictions of calling sentient beings property. So this is kind of like acknowledging that, okay, you're in a boat, the boat is going down, we see that you're drowning. So we take a thimble and we're gonna get the water, this is how we're gonna try to save you with a thimble full of water. The gesture acknowledges the problem while ensuring that the problem persists. And this legal architecture has proven remarkably resilient. Yet, as with all paradigms that fail to align with evolving ethical understandings, this foundation is now exhibiting significant fractures, and those fractures are widening into chasms. The global legal landscape is witnessing the emergence of a new jurisprudential approach to animal status, one that challenges the property paradigm and begins to recognize certain animals as legal persons with inherent rights. I like to think of this as sort of the legal equivalent of the moment in astronomy when scientists realize, oh, the Earth isn't the center of the universe. It's not just a new fact, it's a perspective shift that requires reconceptualizing our entire relationship with the cosmos, or in this case, with other sentient inhabitants of our planet. So I want you to consider these significant developments that have happened recently, which should give pause to anybody who believes that animal personhood is merely a philosophical abstraction. In Argentina, the judiciary has established precedent-setting rulings recognizing legal personhood for non-human animals, beginning with Sandra the orangutan in 2015, and subsequently with Cecilia the chimpanzee in 2016. In the latter case, in Cecilia's case, Judge Maria Alejandra Mauricio explicitly stated that Cecilia is not a thing, nor should she be treated as an object subject to the property rights of humans. So I like to imagine that Cecilia probably, upon hearing that, didn't really understand the legal significance, but she certainly understood the difference between being in a cold, barren cell and going to a sanctuary. Ecuador's constitution has pioneered the recognition of rights of nature, establishing that nature, or Pachamama, where life is reproduced and occurs, has the right to integral respect for its existence and for the maintenance and regeneration of its life cycles, structure, functions, and evolutionary processes. New Zealand has granted legal personhood to the, I always mispronounce this, Wanganui, the Wanganui River, recognizing it as, quote, an indivisible and living whole comprising the Wanganui River from the mountains to the sea, incorporating all its physical and metaphysical elements. So while this recognition really stems from indigenous Maori conceptions of the river rather than animal rights philosophy per se, it does demonstrate the law's capacity to expand personhood beyond human beings. And if a river can become a legal person, I think the case for a dolphin or an elephant becomes considerably stronger. So speaking of elephants, within the United States, the Non-Human Rights Project has been challenging the property status of animals through multiple different pieces of litigation. Their most famous case, which you may have heard about, involves Happy, she is an Asian elephant held at the Bronx Zoo for over 4 decades. So in 2022, the Non-Human Rights Project filed a habeas corpus petition on Happy's behalf, arguing that she was an autonomous being with cognitive capacities that justified recognition of her right to bodily liberty. And for the first time in American legal history, a state's highest court, the New York Court of Appeals, it's not the Supreme Court, it's the Appeals Court, which is their highest court, formally considered whether a non-human animal could be recognized as a legal person entitled to habeas corpus relief. So the court, as we know, ultimately ruled against Happy by a 5-2 margin, but there were 2 dissenting judges, and their opinions really were pretty incredible. Judge Rowan Wilson had this powerful dissent where he said unequivocally, quote, "The issue whether a non-human animal has a fundamental right to liberty protected by the writ of habeas corpus will not go away. The pace of scientific discovery in understanding animal cognition and the evolution of our legal and moral understanding of the rights of animals require that we recognize that at least some animals must be granted certain fundamental rights." I mean, that's incredible. And I want to emphasize, this was not written by an animal rights activist on a blog. This was written by a judge on New York's highest court. So when judges start writing dissenting opinions like that, you know that maybe the seasons are starting to change just a little bit. So legal theorist Vesa Kirki, who's at the University of Helsinki, he's developed a framework for understanding this evolution in his work entitled A Theory of Legal Personhood. So what Professor Kirki argues is that personhood should not be conceptualized as a binary classification, but as a spectrum of legal recognition. Different beings may be entitled to varying degrees of legal recognition based on their cognitive, emotional, and social capabilities, as well as their relationships with humans and other factors. As he observes, legal personhood is not, and I'll add necessarily, an all or nothing concept, but a cluster of different legal positions that can be held to varying degrees by different entities. So this approach is a little bit more nuanced, and it provides a theoretical foundation for courts and legislatures to extend specific rights to animals without necessarily granting them the full panoply of human rights. So the trajectory of this legal evolution leads us to an inescapable conclusion, I would argue. The question is no longer whether animals will be recognized as legal persons. The question that confronts us now is what happens when they are? And that's when things get really interesting and really complicated. So now we are going to turn our attention to money, because as you know, You need to follow the money if you want to understand why change is so difficult. The extension of legal personhood to animals would not merely represent a moral recalibration, it would necessitate a fundamental restructuring of global economic systems that have been predicated on animal exploitation for centuries. We're not talking about minor adjustments to business models, right? We're talking about existential challenges to entire industries. Industrial animal agriculture alone constitutes a $1 trillion global enterprise. It employs millions of individuals across complex supply chains, and it produces food products consumed by billions. And its entire operational framework, from concentrated animal feed operations, CAFOs, to slaughterhouses, is premised on the legal classification of animals as exploitable property. So, you can imagine walking into a shareholder meeting for one of these big companies and saying, hey, good news, animals are no longer property, they're persons, they can sue. Bad news, that means that our entire existence is just a systematic rights violation that's been going on for years. As you can imagine, shareholders would not feel great about that, and it's a problem, it's an issue. California's Prop 12 provides a limited but instructive case study. So this was a ballot initiative which prohibited extreme confinement practices for certain animals, and it was challenged by the pork industry in this case that went all the way to the US Supreme Court. Industry representatives argued that the economic costs of implementing more humane housing systems would devastate their business model and disrupt interstate commerce. So the Supreme Court said, no, we're going to reject your claims. But this case, what's interesting, I think, about this case is that, think of that, it was in the news, you probably read about this a lot, it was huge, it was this huge case, but it merely considered the prohibition of certain confinement practices. It was not a fundamental challenge to the property status of animals. It was, if you will, a skirmish rather than the full-blown battle. So now imagine the implications if courts were to recognize that animals possess not merely the right to minimally adequate living conditions, but a legal right not to be killed for human consumption at all. So legal scholar Ian Offer, who's at the University of Birmingham in the UK, he observed, the moment the law ceases to recognize animals as commodities, the economic fallout will be profound. The question will not be whether businesses can adjust, but whether they can survive at all under a paradigm that fundamentally delegitimizes their core activities. And of course, this economic disruption would go well beyond traditional animal agriculture. There's a $400 billion global leather industry. The pharmaceutical and biomedical research sectors that would be radically transformed. Entertainment venues like zoos and aquariums and marine parks. All of these institutions and businesses and so many more would have to confront fundamental questions about their continued legal viability if the animals that they're using were recognized as having rights to liberty and autonomy. Historical precedent suggests that even morally necessary economic transitions entail significant social costs. When a society delegitimizes a previously accepted form of exploitation, the economic consequences are both profound and widespread. And now I want to emphasize that these economic difficulties do not constitute an argument against animal personhood or animal rights, just as the economic disruption of abolishing human slavery did not justify its continuation. But they do require us to think seriously about transition strategies. So author and theorist Gregory Smulovitz-Zucker, he's argued that animal rights advocates must develop robust transitional justice frameworks to address these economic disruptions. And he says, the movement for animal rights must not only articulate the moral case against animal exploitation, but must propose viable economic alternatives for those whose livelihoods currently depend on that exploitation. So this presents a profound challenge for the animal law movement. How do we balance the moral imperative of recognizing animal rights with the pragmatic necessity of managing economic transitions? How do we implement justice for animals while minimizing harm to human communities dependent on animal industries? So these questions, they have no simple answers, but they demand our serious attention if the movement for animal personhood is to translate moral vision into viable policy. And let me be clear, if we don't develop these answers, opponents of animal personhood and of animal rights certainly will, and they will use economic fear as one of their most powerful weapons against progress. So now let's talk about something that arguably is even more challenging than economics: culture. Because if you think people are defensive about their money, wait until you challenge their identity. The recognition of animal personhood would not merely disrupt economic systems, it would challenge deeply held cultural identities and traditions that have been shaped by assumptions of human exceptionalism and dominion over animals. So across all societies, cultural practices involving animals often function not merely as entertainment or sustenance, but as an expression of collective identity and historical continuity. From Spanish bullfighting to Japanese whaling, Thanksgiving turkey, religious animal sacrifice, these practices reflect and reinforce particular conceptions of human-animal relationships. And I'm reminded of a conversation that I had with somebody who happened to be Spanish, and he was a defender of bullfighting. And he said to me, "To understand bullfighting is to understand Spain." And now, I don't know if I agree with that, because Spain is a highly complex society and lots of people there are against bullfighting, have different opinions about bullfighting. But his statement reveals how deeply some people identify with practices that involve animal use. As animal law OG and Professor Joyce Tisler said, the assumption of human dominion over animals is not just embedded in our laws, but in our very sense of self, our understanding about what it means to be human. And when you challenge these practices, you're not just saying this activity is wrong, you're saying your understanding of who you are is built on a moral error. And that's a really hard message for people to hear. University of Victoria's own wonderful professor and legal scholar Monisha Dekka extends this analysis by examining the intersections between speciesism and other systems of oppression. And she argues that the belief in human superiority over animals is so deeply entrenched in law, culture, and philosophy that the shift to recognizing animals as persons will not just be a legal revolution, it will be a cultural one that fundamentally challenges dominant ontologies of human identity. So this cultural dimension helps explain why resistance to animal personhood often transcends mere economic self-interest. When advocates challenge practices like trophy hunting, rodeos, or traditional animal-based cuisines, they're not simply questioning specific activities, but challenging narratives of identity that give meaning to individual and collective lives. I once spoke to a rodeo enthusiast, and he said to me, this isn't just entertainment, this is our heritage. And that point is crucial. People don't just engage in these practices, they see themselves through these practices. Historical parallels suggest that such identity-based resistance can prove more difficult to overcome than purely economic opposition. Cultural practices often persist long after their economic rationality has been undermined. For instance, bullfighting continues in some certain regions of Spain despite being economically unsustainable without public subsidies, precisely because it functions as a symbol of cultural identity and historical continuity. People will quite literally pay to maintain practices they identify with, even when those practices no longer make economic sense. In addition, the cultural dimensions of animal exploitation are often intertwined with issues of race, class, and colonialism. Again, Professor Dekka has written extensively on this. But as an example, indigenous peoples may view certain animal use practices not as exploitation, but as expressions of spiritual relationships and cultural sovereignty. Working class communities may experience criticism of meat consumption as implicitly classist, given the historical association of plant-based diets with socioeconomic privilege. I recall attending a conference once, and there was an indigenous speaker who spoke very powerfully and challenged the animal rights advocates in the room to consider how their movement might replicate colonial dynamics if it failed to respect indigenous relationships with animals. And I'll tell you, a lot of people were profoundly uncomfortable in that moment, but it was such an important reminder that justice for animals cannot come at the expense of justice for historically marginalized human communities. University of Michigan professor Kyle Powes-White has argued that animal rights discourse must be attentive to those complexities. And what he said is, advocacy for animal personhood must engage seriously with questions of cultural sovereignty and environmental justice if it is to avoid replicating colonial power dynamics in its pursuit of justice for animals. So these cultural complexities do not negate the moral case for animal personhood, but they do necessitate nuanced approaches to implementation. They require us to ask, how can we advance animal personhood while respecting cultural diversity? How can we distinguish between cultural practices that merit accommodation and those that fundamentally violate animal rights? How can we develop intercultural dialogue about human-animal relationships that neither imposes Western ethical frameworks nor accepts cultural relativism as a justification for exploitation? And perhaps most challenging of all, how do we have these conversations in ways that don't immediately devolve into accusations and defensiveness? Because if there's one thing that I've learned in my years of animal advocacy is that the moment someone feels that their identity is under attack, productive dialogue becomes, well, maybe not impossible, but incredibly challenging and difficult. So now let's assume that we've somehow navigated the economic and cultural disruptions that I've described. We've restructured industry, we've transformed cultural practices, we've established a new social consensus that animals are legal persons with rights. Great. But even then, we would face enormous challenges in operationalizing this vision, because implementing rights isn't just about declaring them. It's great to have something on paper, but you have to actually implement them, right? And it's about creating systems that protect these things. So I want you to consider the administrative challenges that would emerge. Legal representation. If animals are recognized as rights bearers, how would their interests be represented in legal proceedings? So Professor David Faber at Michigan State University, he has proposed a guardianship model similar to that used for incompetent humans. But questions remain about, okay, who would serve as guardians? How would they be selected, and how conflicts of interest would be managed? Imagine the practical complexities. Would animal advocacy organizations serve as institutional representatives? Would there be specialized animal courts? And what about the inevitable conflicts between different animal interests? Who speaks for the prey? Who speaks for the predator, who also has rights? And these, again, these aren't just abstract theoretical questions, they're the nuts and bolts of making rights real. Rights adjudication. How would the courts balance competing rights claims between animals and humans, or between different animal species? So philosophers and authors Sue Donaldson and Will Kymlicka have proposed a political theory of animal rights that differentiate between different groups of animals. Some of you may be familiar with this. So they say domesticated animals could be known as co-citizens, wild animals as sovereign communities, and liminal animals, meaning sort of the animals that live on the margins, as denizens, each with distinct rights and relationships to human political communities. But implementing such a framework would require unprecedented legal innovation. Imagine a court trying to determine whether a city's decision to restrict access to vegetation violates the rights of the deer as denizens. Or consider how a judge might adjudicate a case where expanding human housing encroaches on habitat claimed as sovereign territory by a wild animal community. So these, and this is, I'm not being facetious. I mean, these are the types of cases that we would see if we do establish actual, real, enforceable animal rights. And then what about enforcement mechanisms? What institutional structures would be necessary to monitor and enforce animal rights? Would we need specialized animal protection agencies, expanded judicial capacity, or new forms of legal standing for animal advocates? Current animal protection enforcement is notoriously underfunded and often ineffective even for existing welfare laws. Scaling this up to rights enforcement would require massive institutional expansion. Think about the resources needed to really adequately enforce human rights protections, and then multiply that by billions of animals who would theoretically hold legal rights. And then there are cross-border issues. Animal migration, international trade, and ecological systems transcend national boundaries. How would animal personhood be implemented in a world of sovereign states with divergent approaches to animal status? We already struggle to create effective international human rights regimes, but now imagine trying to establish an international legal framework for animal rights when some nations are still resistant to basic animal welfare measures. Would we see animal rights sanctions, refugee claims for animals from jurisdictions that fail to recognize their rights? The international dimensions alone are staggering. Professor Charlotte Blattner of the University of Lausanne, she's emphasized that these administrative challenges, while formidable, are not insurmountable. She says the history of human rights implementation demonstrates that societies can develop sophisticated institutional mechanisms to protect rights holders who cannot advocate for themselves. The challenge lies not in the impossibility of such systems, but in the political will to create them. I tend to agree with her assessment, but I would add that creating these systems will require unprecedented legal creativity and institutional innovation. We're not talking about tweaking existing frameworks. We're talking about building entirely new legal infrastructures. It's almost like being asked to design an air traffic control system before planes have been built. I mean, we're having to think about these things into the future when we don't even know exactly what that future is going to look like. And now we come to what I consider to be the most philosophically challenging frontier of animal personhood theory: our responsibilities towards suffering in nature. If we recognize that animals have inherent moral worth and value and rights, does this create obligations to prevent natural suffering? Wild animals experience disease, starvation, predation, and natural disasters. The scale of this suffering is immense. Billions of sentient beings experience painful deaths in nature every single year. Naturalist and filmmaker David Attenborough once famously said, "The natural world is a world of violence." For all its beauty, nature is also a realm of constant suffering. And if we take animal suffering seriously, can we justify non-intervention in these natural processes? Professor Oscar Horta of the University of Santiago de Compostela has argued that recognizing animal rights logically entails some responsibility toward wild animal suffering. And he said, if we believe that animals matter morally and that we have duties not to harm them and to assist them when they are in need, then we cannot consistently ignore the immense suffering that occurs in nature. So following this logic to its conclusion leads to truly radical implications. Would animal personhood require us to police predator-prey relationships, to provide medical care to wild populations, to redesign natural systems to minimize suffering? And of course it all sounds kind of absurd, but with our current technological limitations and our understanding, any kind of large-scale intervention and predation does seem both impractical and potentially catastrophic for the individual animal and for the systems. But the philosophical question remains. If a gazelle has a right not to suffer, why does that right disappear when the suffering comes from a lion rather than a human? The distinction between natural and human-caused suffering may make practical sense, but its moral basis is less clear than we might like to admit. Texas A&M philosophy professor Claire Palmer has developed a relational theory of animal ethics that distinguishes between positive and negative duties toward different animal populations. And under this framework, we might have stronger obligations to assist domesticated animals with whom we have created special bonds and relationships than to intervene in the lives of wild animals. So this approach has some intuitive appeal, and it also has some practical advantages. It allows us to recognize special obligations to animals whose vulnerability we have created in large part through domestication, while maintaining a general policy of non-intervention in wild nature. But it still leaves open the question of whether this distinction is morally arbitrary or based on sound ethical principles. I suspect that most of us here, myself included, feel deeply uncomfortable with the idea of systematically intervening in nature to prevent predation or other sources of wild animal suffering. There's something intuitively wrong about the vision of a nature policed by humans. But, I would argue we should at least have the intellectual honesty to acknowledge that this tension exists and that it is potentially within our moral framework if we simultaneously insist on the inherent rights of all sentient beings. So perhaps this is one area where the perfect truly is the enemy of the good, where practical limitations and ecological wisdom should temper the application of our moral principles. Or perhaps it simply reveals the limitations of applying rights frameworks developed for human societies to the entirety of the natural world. Either way, it deserves our serious philosophical attention. If the recognition of animal personhood is not merely a theoretical possibility but an emerging reality, how might we envision its practical implementation? I think it's important first to acknowledge that whatever form animal personhood eventually does take, it won't arrive as a sudden revolution that transforms society overnight. More likely, it will emerge through an extended process of legal, economic, and cultural evolution. What University of Alberta Professor Jessica Eisen has called a transitional justice framework for animal rights. So, drawing on models used in societies transitioning from authoritarian to democratic governance, this approach acknowledges that the shift from treating animals as property to recognizing them as persons cannot occur instantaneously, but requires graduated implementation that balances moral imperatives with practical realities. So key elements of such a framework might include a truth and reconciliation process, institutional mechanisms to acknowledge the history of animal exploitation and create collective understanding of the harms inflicted. This might sound a little bit strange initially, truth and reconciliation for animals, but I want you to consider how important these processes have been in human contexts. They create shared moral understanding and establish a foundation for new social arrangements. And for animal personhood, this might involve documentation of exploitation practices, public education about animal sentience and cognition, with formal acknowledgement of historical wrongs. A gradual rights implementation, phased recognition of animal rights, beginning with prohibitions on the most egregious forms of exploitation, and then gradually expanding to fuller recognition of personhood. We're already seeing this in some jurisdictions: bans on the worst forms of confinement, prohibitions on using certain species in entertainment, and recognition of the most cognitively complex animals as legal persons in a few jurisdictions. This gradual approach allows social adaptation while maintaining moral progress. Just transition policies, economic support, and retraining programs for workers and communities currently dependent on animal exploitation industries. In my view, this is absolutely crucial, and it's too often neglected in animal advocacy. If we don't address the human costs of transition, we create powerful and legitimate opposition to animal rights. Just transition isn't just strategically smart, it's morally required if we're serious about justice in all of its form. Educational initiatives, comprehensive reforms to educational systems to foster greater understanding of animal cognition, sentience, and moral status. Cultural change ultimately requires generational change, and educational systems that teach accurate information about animal cognition and sentience, expose the realities of the exploitation systems, and encourage ethical reflection are, in my view, essential for long-term transformation. Institutional innovation, development of new governance structures specifically designed to represent and protect animal interests. So, as we were saying earlier, this might include animal advocates and legislative bodies, specialized courts for animal rights cases, administrative agencies focused on animal protection, and new legal mechanisms for representing animal interests. University of Chicago professor Martha Nussbaum, she recently published a book, and in it she talks about a capabilities approach, which she believes offers a useful framework for conceptualizing animal rights implementation, focusing on ensuring that animals can exercise their natural capabilities and flourish according to their specific species needs. As Professor Nussbaum argues, quote, "We need a new theory of justice, one that does not prioritize human convenience over the fundamental interests of other sentient beings. The capability approach recognizes that different species have different flourishing conditions, and justice requires that all sentient beings have the opportunity to develop their characteristic capabilities." So what I find most helpful about the transitional justice frameworks is that they acknowledge both the moral urgency of change and the practical necessity of managing that change responsibly. They recognize that establishing new rights regimes is not simply a matter of legal declaration, but requires building new social, economic, and institutional infrastructures. They also acknowledge an uncomfortable truth that pure rights theory sometimes neglects. Transitions create losers as well as winners. people whose livelihoods depend on animal exploitation will face genuine hardship in a transition to animal personhood. Addressing these impacts isn't just as strategic, as I mentioned before, but it's an ethical imperative if we're serious about comprehensive justice. So, the world in which animals are recognized as legal persons is no longer a distant philosophical ideal. It's an emerging reality that demands our serious intellectual and practical engagement. The legal foundations of animal property status are eroding. The ethical case for animal personhood is strengthening. The scientific evidence of animal cognition, emotion, and sentience continues to accumulate. Courts, legislatures, and civil society are increasingly willing to challenge these anthropocentric legal frameworks. The progress is both necessary and it's disruptive. It's going to challenge economic systems, cultural identities, governance structures, and perhaps even our understanding of humanity's place in the natural world. When I first began working in animal law decades ago now, people would often just sort of smile indulgently when I would talk about animal rights, like almost as if they heard me say, I believe in unicorns. Today, those same ideas about animal rights, not unicorns, are being debated in the highest courts of nations around the world. And that to me is very exciting. So the question is no longer whether this transformation will occur, but how it will unfold, and whether we will shape it thoughtfully or be dragged along reactively as it happens around us. So I want to leave you now with a story that illustrates both how far we've come and how far we have yet to go. Several years ago, I was talking to a senior partner at this major law firm about one of the habeas corpus cases. And so he listened, he was very polite, and he listened very politely, and then he said, 20 years ago, I would have laughed you out of my office. I'm not laughing today, but I'm not sure I agree with you. And then he paused, and he said, but my children, they are probably going to wonder why this was ever even controversial. And that generational shift really gives me hope. But it also reminds me that transformative social change takes time that billions of suffering animals don't have. So our challenge is to accelerate this evolution while managing its impacts responsibly. The uncomfortable future of animal law, even if everything goes right, will require us to confront really difficult questions, navigate complex transitions, and reimagine fundamental aspects of social organization. It will require both moral vision and practical wisdom, theoretical clarity and implementation expertise. So the question before us is no longer whether animals deserve rights. The intellectual and ethical case has been made. The jurisprudential evolution has begun. The question now is, what will we, as legal scholars, practitioners, advocates, and citizens, what are we willing to do to prepare for and shape this inevitable transformation? And I hope that our collective answer will be everything necessary to create a just world for all humans and non-humans alike. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pam. I would like to thank the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights Law and Policy, as well as the Faculty of Law for to sponsor this talk. I'd like to thank all of you for engaging with us today and everyone who joined us online. Also, Holly at the back, who has coordinated everything in relation to the talk so capably. Thank you. And most of all, please join me in thanking Pamela Frasch for this capacious and visionary talk. Thank you so much, Pamela, for coming today and sharing your recent work with us.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you.